I'd like to say a huge thank you and welcome to our 5 speakers. We're so grateful to you all for giving up your time this evening to share your experiences, knowledge and expertise. Off here. So just before I hand the mic to Fatin, I'd like to read you just a couple of excerpts from the statement that was released last night by John Brady. And John Brady described the vote to adopt the Sinn Féin motion on the annexation of Palestinian lands by Israel as a historic moment, a victory for justice and a recognition of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. He said, "Tonight the Irish people have secured a historic victory for the people of Palestine. The decision by the members of the Dáil to vote to accept the Sinn Féin motion on annexation is a sure reflection of the strength of feeling that runs in this country at the treatment of the Palestinian people by the apartheid state of Israel. The respected international groups Al-Haq, Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem have placed before the world the undeniable evidence that the state of Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid. Ireland now stands as the first country in Ireland to categorically state without equivocation that Israel has carried out the crime of annexation in the occupied Palestinian territories." He went on to say, "I must stress this is more than mere symbolism. Annexation is a crime under international law." In advance of the debate, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, Michael Lynk, felt compelled to write to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, imploring the Irish government to act to recognise that de facto annexation had taken place. And the Irish people through the Dáil have now stated that Israel is guilty of that crime. It is now incumbent on the Irish government to accept the imprimatur of the Irish people and take this motion and press for action in the EU and for action on the UN Security Council on this issue. And under the law, there must be accountability. And now the international community must be pressed into holding Israel to account for the treatment of Palestinian civilians and the destruction of their homes and infrastructure. The Irish government must act to introduce the Occupied Territories Bill. It must recognise the state of Palestine. It must ensure that Israel is held accountable for its action by the international community. So a historic night indeed. And to look closer at the history and current situation of Palestine and our Palestinian sisters and brothers, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Fatin Al Tamimi. You're very welcome.
Yeah, very welcome. The Sinn Féin's motion and the passage of it in the government, hoping, although it's stating the facts, which is already Palestine's occupied and annexed already by Israel for the past 56 years now. But still, we welcome this move, and hopefully what we need is to press on, as you said, and as John Brady mentioned, to enact the Occupied Territories Bill and do actions, asking the Irish government to do actions and sanction Israel and hold Israel accountable for their war crimes against my people in Palestine. We Palestinians are deprived from our basic human rights. Like, I am deprived from going home to visit my homeland. I'm originally from Palestine, my father from Hebron and my mother from Gaza, and I still have extended family living there. I'm not allowed to go and visit my homeland. My parents couldn't go and visit their parents. My parents left Palestine in the late 50s to better life, to live some abroad, and we were brought there. So since they left after the 67 war, they were not allowed to go back. They were stripped from their identity, Palestinian identity, and they were not allowed to go back. So we still, till this day, we have no right of return. We are deprived from the movement of freedom of movement. Like, my family in Gaza can't go visit my family in Hebron. My aunties and uncles, they can't visit each other. My sister, I have a sister in Gaza, can't go and visit my aunties in Hebron. They can't go visit Jerusalem or pray in Al-Aqsa Mosque. we are deprived from dignity as Palestinian lives in the West Bank with all these checkpoints, military Israeli checkpoints. They humiliate Palestinians daily at these checkpoints. And of course, with the wall being built, preventing people from traveling around or visiting each other, or even going to look after their crops in their own land. Of course, all this round started this time. Suddenly, the media knows the Palestinians and they hear about us because of the resistance, the Palestinian resistance. It started all from the Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is a small neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem. These people are Palestinian families. According to UNRWA, there are nearly 1,000 Palestinians living in that area, in that neighborhood. Almost half of them are children. They face forced expulsion in a case filed against them by settler organizations, and to replace them by Jewish Israeli illegal settlers. So these Palestinians were forced to, they were asked to forcibly be removed from their homes for the establishment of more illegal settlements in East Jerusalem. And then the Al-Aqsa attack, when Israeli forces attacked Palestinians, worshippers in Al-Aqsa compound while they pray in the holiest month of Ramadan. And then every Palestinian in the historic Palestine, they started resisting this and demonstrating against what's happening to their brothers and sisters in Sheikh Jarrah in solidarity and within Al-Aqsa. So then Gaza, people in Gaza started resisting again with the every Palestinians in historic Palestine, and then the whole bombardment on Gaza started. People in Gaza have been under siege for the past 15 years. I have family there. My sister is still there. My nieces, nephews, I haven't seen for years because of the illegal siege on Gaza. They can't leave. I can't go and visit them. My nieces, my aunts at this, or my nieces and nephews witnessed 3 major attacks in Gaza in 2008, 2009, and then in the 2012, and then the 2014, and this recent one. So you can't imagine the terror these children lived under. One of my nieces lost 2 of her school friends in the 2009 attack on Gaza. In 2012, she lost a teacher. My mother lost 5 of her cousins in one attack in 2009. This latest attack, thank God, my family survived. They're like in bodies, but they're mentally, they're of course terrorized, traumatized. They used to sleep all in one room, just in the middle of their apartment, not knowing if they're gonna wake up the following morning or not. My aunt, one of my aunts, she had to flee her home because she lives in a building, a high building, and so she's on the top floor. See, she had to flee her home, and her neighbors, all her neighbors, two buildings beside her, they're completely demolished, and 50 people are gone. She lost all her neighbors. That's how every Palestinian, of course, felt that thing. It's me personally. I've witnessed, or not physically there, but emotionally, of course, all the trauma they've been under. This latest attack, more than 248 Palestinians were killed, including 66 children and 39 women. Thousands more have been wounded, already overflowing. Hospitals have been bombed. Media offices and educational facilities have been attacked as well. Hundreds of homes have been destroyed. All these war crimes and violation of international law. Tens of thousands, of course, of people are homeless. They flee to the UN schools to stay in them, and they're still there because they have no other shelters. The Israel even bombed the one COVID testing laboratory in Gaza with this pandemic time. In the West Bank, again, I have my other side of the family in the West Bank, and the Israeli occupation forces are attacking Palestinian demonstrators with live fires, so-called rubber bullets, and tear gas. Killing more than 25 people so far at this latest round. In Jerusalem, of course, and inside the apartheid state of Israel itself, they're attacking and arresting lots of Palestinians there, and they were allowing the Israeli mobs, right wings, Israeli attacks to attack the Palestinians everywhere in the streets, in their homes, and chanting death to Arabs, all under the protection of the Israeli police. So Palestinians are under attack every single day from the violence of colonial oppression. The daily violence of checkpoints, home demolition, evictions, illegal settlements, night raids, political prisoners, child prisoners, enforced exile, and refugeehood. The violence of unceasing violation of international law and systematic human rights abuses. The everyday routine violence of occupation, colonization, and apartheid. As we heard a lot these days, a lot of the word apartheid, if you all learned about the Human Rights Watch report that clearly says that Israel is apartheid, which we Palestinians have been saying for the past 100 years, that we are living under this apartheid. So I want you all to read these human rights reports, study them, and make the government or the international community, all of them, to do what's in their recommendation, which is if Israel is apartheid, then use this apartheid term to put sanction on Israel for their war crimes and for their apartheid crimes. The same way as South African apartheid, how it ended, the apartheid South Africa, it should be ended in Palestine. I don't know, have I time or to talk actions, or will you leave the actions for later?
If you want to leave them for later, and everybody can maybe then take part in what you tell us.
Perfect. So this is basically, there are lots to say, to be honest with you, but this is, I tried to just sum up the little bit that what I wanted, the conclusion should be that the international, with your support, the international support has to end the Israeli impunity and end this apartheid. And we'll talk more after the speakers finish maybe, and we can discuss whatever you'd like to say, and then we'll go for the actions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks a million. Thanks for sharing that with us. Like, I can't imagine on a human level what it must be like to live like that. So, and to not see your family or your loved ones.
Couldn't sleep, couldn't function for the past few weeks because of all what's happening. It's beyond words, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your honesty and your courage in speaking out.
Important to listen to Fatin. I think anybody following that, you know, and how you can, I suppose, rest it all, do you mean, given what was happening over the last number of weeks. But I suppose I was asked to come on because I went in 2014 to Palestine as part of a Gaughan NGL delegation of 13 MEPs. And I suppose for me personally, I suppose the Irish and the affiliation with Palestine is something that's just, it's a long-standing solidarity that we have, and especially for, I suppose, as a Sinn Féin member, but you know, I think most Irish people stand in solidarity with Palestine for years. But I think what changed in 2014 was the fact that more people were able to view exactly what was happening because of social media. And while we criticize social media a lot of the time, I think it was a real sea change in 2014 that we witnessed with our own eyes the devastation and the indiscriminate violence that was being meted out on Gaza. And so it was on the back of that that the delegation went out to Palestine. We went out to see, I suppose the idea was that what humanitarian aid would be needed following that Operation Protective Edge, as it was called, which I think took over 2,000 lives and almost 600 children died in that attack. We were denied access to Gaza, you know, which we probably were expecting anyway. But we did do a lot of sort of fact finding on the journey for a few days that we were there, and I don't think until you see it with your own eyes that you can appreciate that it is an apartheid system. The walls that are there, the separate buses, the treatment. And we went to Hebron, and I'll have a couple of photographs just to show, like literally 3, but this is Hebron. Sorry, I share my screen now. Okay. Oh, you've disabled the share host screening. It's fine. So in Hebron is one of the occupied territories that I think there's 400 settlers there was the figures we had from the time, but there were 6,000 military and police personnel protecting the 400 settlers. And when you go through them, because what the picture shows is just netting that's put up over the market. So it's bags of netting, and the idea is because the settlers will throw down bags of urine onto Palestinian market stalls and just kids that are walking up the streets. And, you know, so that basically these bags are to try and stop urine and feces that are being thrown down on top of Palestinians. But also in the sort of a 900-meter stretch that we were brought along, there's 120 checkpoints, literally checkpoint every few meters, and you witness school children who have to go through these checkpoints. And I suppose it's reminiscent of when you see some of the images of in Belfast as well, that, like, you know, when kids grow up and this is their only engagement with Israelis, is people in armed uniforms who are intimidating them and searching their school bags and pulling out their lunch boxes, and that, you know, it's devastating to see then that cycle continue. Do you mean? And that children are just brought up with that image. But like when we were in Hebron, we were brought along that trail and shown, you know, what kids have to go through every single day. But the following week, like, we were shown video footage of a young child, he was 7, and he was detained for 40 minutes by a number of armed soldiers just for trying to get to school with his school bag on his back. We also went to Bethlehem, which I suppose is there's a tourist zone, and, you know, lots of Western tourists will go to Bethlehem to visit the important sites. But what you hear then is that you're told when you go to the airport, don't spend any money in Bethlehem, don't give any money to Palestinians, because, you know, it only goes to fund terrorism. So it's always trying to undermine the Palestinian economy. But then I suppose the most harrowing part was we went to the hospitals where I suppose certain victims of Protective Edge were allowed to move out of Gaza and be brought to hospital. And even then, you know, if you're a male of a certain age, your chances of being allowed to even get the necessary medical treatment that you need is greatly reduced. So most of the patients we saw in the hospitals were children, and they're children who were there without their parents. And in one case, one little child who had lost both of his legs, but his parents had also lost limbs. You know, so, like, I don't know how, you know, you try and process that and in your head go, like, you know, you're elected rep at the time for the European Parliament, and the European Parliament votes to fund infrastructural projects and votes to fund water treatment and electricity, and then Israel comes in every few years and systematically destroys everything. And then you go into a European Parliament and you talk about what you've seen with your own eyes, what you've witnessed, and you say they have to be sanctions. There has to be sanctions for this, even if you don't do it from a human rights point of view, just from a purely economic point of view of spending European money on infrastructure that Israel just indiscriminately destroys every couple of years. You know, and so it's so deeply frustrating. And I suppose it was such an experience to be there and to meet with Palestinian people who I don't know how they carry on in the way that they do and with such dignity. But yeah, for me, the hospital was probably the most harrowing experience, that when we were there. And then we went to UNRWA Center and I think I had tweeted that only recently, the photograph of me in the UNRWA Center with crates and crates of humanitarian aid, so antibiotics, wheelchairs, plasters, bandages, first aid kits, crutches, everything just sitting in boxes and trucks lined up ready to take them, and just the Israeli authorities just wouldn't give the go-ahead for that treatment to go into Gaza. So, you know, you destroy their hospitals, you destroy the roads, and then you deny the access to the vital medical. I mean, they're war crimes, what are being committed and what is being witnessed. You know, and then, so I suppose like that, and then to be shown like for kids to deal with the psychological trauma of what they've experienced. Yeah, so that's what we witnessed with our own eyes, first-hand experience. We then went back to, when we were traveling back to the airport, we were all stopped, and I think anybody who's been in the airport will talk of the experience you get. Everybody is separated out, and you're asked what was the nature of your journey, who did you see, who did you visit, did you accept any gifts, and then they cross-reference the stories to make sure they all tally up. And this is just going, as you know, through an airport. You're forced to go through all of that. And unfortunately for us, one of the young interns who was with us had a backpack instead of a case, and so she was sent separately. And when they were going through the bag, because we had been warned, don't say you took any gifts, because the Palestinians will give you gifts and their, you know, weapons and bombs and all of this nonsense that they spout. But this poor 21-year-old, they took out a cup, and it was a Red Crescent cup, and they said, well, what's this? And she said, oh, we got it as a gift at the Red Crescent Center. And immediately we all just went, oh no. So effectively that was noted. We went on, carried on. I got to the hotel back in Brussels, and the following morning when I opened my suitcase, inside your suitcase is a postcard from the Israeli authorities saying that they decided to go through your bag. Not in front of you, not while you're watching, but to go through your bag. And I think I had nail varnish remover, which the lid had been taken off, and the entire contents of your suitcase had the nail varnish remover poured over, which is nothing, but it just shows you that sort of petty mentality that's there in the treatment of it. But I suppose that's kind of, I'm already gone over my time. I said I wouldn't, but that's the experience I had, and like it'll stay with me forever, you know, just seeing those Palestinian children. And I do think that the one thing that's changing every time is more and more people are witnessing it, and more people are going to force their governments to act.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the social media and access for ordinary people, and for ordinary people to film and also to witness, is hugely important. It's made a huge, big difference. And even just imagining the microaggressions that you guys suffered over a few days, what it must be like, as Fatin talked about, to live under that and to be born into that and not know any difference. It's incredible. Yeah, it's incredible. Thanks for that, Lynn. Appreciate it very much.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you are keeping well. My name is James, and I'm a retired member of the Irish Defence Forces. During my career, I completed 13 tours of duty on UN peacekeeping missions. 9 of those tours were in South Lebanon. Over the next few minutes, I'd like to give you a small insight into my experiences. Mainly my first mission in 1982 during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which they called Peace for Galilee, or by the Lebanese as simply the invasion. I never envisaged myself sitting here tonight talking to you about the plight of the Palestinian people, nor did I think my first duty in Lebanon would be protecting children who were attending a primary school in the village of Bereshit. A real threat had been made to attack a school as a reprisal for an earlier attack. It was a mixed school with both Lebanese and Palestinian children who studied and played together without any problems. Some background into how this UN mission came about. In 1978, as the result of continuous attacks and incursions into northern Israel by PLO fighters from Lebanon, the Israeli army invaded South Lebanon in the hope of pushing the PLO back across the Litani River and out of shooting range of their northern border, farms, kibbutzes, or whatever. Due in part to the high number of Lebanese and Palestinian civilian casualties, the UN passed Resolution 425 and 426, which called for the withdrawal of Israeli forces and the Lebanese to exert authority over the south, which had been lost to the PLO and Christian militias. In other words, they took over the South Lebanon and they ran it. A peacekeeping force called UNIFIL, or the United Nations Intern Force in Lebanon, was established to oversee the implementation of 425 and 426 as agreed by all parties. Now, an interesting side note to that was the Palestinians weren't involved in it. They were one of the main protagonists of the conflict, but they weren't even consulted or involved in it. It was between Lebanon and Israel and the UN. UNIFIL with a force of 4,000 to 6,000 was to take over from the Israelis in 3 phases. But phase 3 was handed over to Christian militias, which were major Haddad forces. And what they done there was they were to secure Israel's northern border. And what they did was create a buffer to protect their northern border and placing UNIFIL in an impossible situation. Needless to say that this didn't prevent the PLO and their families returning to South to continue with their struggle. Though UNIFIL were toothless in preventing attacks from either side, their observing and reporting made it difficult for the combatants to deny breaches of the agreement. UNIFIL presence at that time probably saved hundreds of lives, because now what we had then was UNIFIL was acting as modern day texting and TikTok and whatever. We could identify these atrocities that were taking place, and it was an embarrassment to the Israelis that they weren't getting away with it any longer. I roll forward now to 1982, when the Israelis wrongly accused the PLO of the attempted assassination of their ambassador in London, and that was used as a cover to invade Lebanon again. Prior to this, there had been no attacks from the PLO from South Lebanon. I know because I was there, and the Palestinians were observing the ceasefire. While on duty on the 5th of June 1982, I reported large convoys approaching from the south. While attempting to radio over my report, the net was jammed by the Israelis because they gave us our call signs and signals. The patrol officer who arrived claimed there was people leaving the enclave for the night. If so, they were going in the wrong direction. They were actually heading north. And that would lead me to believe that the UN were foretold about this invasion. On the 6th of June, the following day, there was a full-scale invasion. No attempt was made to stop the Israelis by the UN because our mandate didn't cover that. And we were told, close the checkpoints and withdraw to the security of our posts. It was surreal to me, on one hand, to witness the flight of the Palestinians and their families heading north, and on the other hand, the influx of Lebanese families to the south to reoccupy homes which the PLO had vacated. The Israeli army was welcomed by locals, throwing flowers and rice. I couldn't understand that. Fellow Arabs or fellow people welcoming an invasion force. On the remainder of my tour, our duties were limited to checkpoints, day patrols, observing and reporting, shadowing the Israelis when they came into our area. A lot of humanitarian work, while further north, the Tyre pocket was cleared of Palestinians, the PLO fighters and their families, who headed to West Beirut. In time, another multinational force came into Beirut to escort the Palestinian fighters out, as agreed by these forces. The Lebanese president was assassinated because there was a danger he was going to sign a peace agreement with the Israelis. And what still haunts me today was the fact that the world stood by for 3 days in September while the massacre of between 400 and 3,000 old men, Palestinian old men, women and children took place in the Shabra and Shatila camps under the noses of the Israeli army and world press. I don't think anyone ever faced war crimes for that. Now, it's impossible for me to sum up all my experiences in 5 minutes for what took place on that first mission. But in conclusion, I would like to say nothing has changed for the Palestinian people in nearly 40 years of peacekeeping in the region by the UN. It's resolution and counter-resolution, and all dictated by the Israelis or the Americans or one of the other 5 members of the Permanent Security Council. Getting back to what Una said earlier on, the most positive thing that has been done since I have been involved in, not involved, but understanding this conflict for the past 40 years was coincidentally happened yesterday by Sinn Féin's dawn motion to call the Israeli settlement what they are. And just for Lynn there, in 1982, I went to Jerusalem on a 60-hour tour. And in Bethlehem, I bought this Bible of a Palestinian. On the front of it contains earth from the Holy Land and water from the Dead Sea on the back. Going on their argument, I'm now a supporter of terrorism because I bought this of a Palestinian. Okay, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions that you may have later on. Thanks, Una.
Thank you very much, James. Thanks a million. I mean, just to have an insight into the military situation is really interesting, but it also underscores the sheer complexity of the situation and what's been allowed to happen in the entire region. So thank you very much for that.
Talk about the history of boycott. I mean, it started here in Mayo. Was the 3rd Earl of Erin that basically was a landowner here, and he had a land agent, and the land agent was Captain Boycott, and both of them were very aggressive towards their tenants. And it was Michael Davitt that basically started with the Land League Association, and with that it was that nobody would work for boycott. Nobody would, no matter what it was. So in his house, he had no staff. The postman wouldn't deliver any post to him, and nobody would work the fields. Now at that stage, they had the fields all planted, but there was nobody to take in the crops. So what happened then was that they actually had to send for people from Northern Ireland, from Tyrone, to come down and collect the crops. But to do that, they actually had to put in place that to get the RIC at the time and to guard them the whole way down and stay stationed around the area to protect them from the locals. By the time they had everything done, it actually cost them 26,000 in security fees, and they sold all the crops for 7,000. this was seen to be very successful by the Irish, so it actually started replicating very quickly around the other landowners. And the British could see that this was actually very dangerous and could turn out to be very costly. So they seceded to Davitt's demands of the Land League. And so the Land League Reform Act was brought in. Now, when Michael Davitt was an old man, he was actually in a hotel in London, and this Indian man came up to him and said, I am taking my teachings from you. I've learned from what the Irish have done, and I'm taking my teachings from you. And that little man turned out to be Mahatma Gandhi, who started the salt boycotts, and also the boycotts where all administration staff wouldn't work for so many days in India. And this started to bring the Indian administration to a grinding halt. And Gandhi himself says that this was a major part of India gaining its independence. And then you move on to the 1960s. And in the 1960s, Martin Luther King started using the boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and Rosa Parks and people like that. They started the boycott of the buses. And with that simple act of boycotting the buses, the bus companies actually started to go bankrupt. They actually had to get state funding to keep them going. And the states were not happy with this because they didn't want to be handing out money to bus companies. And that was a major part of the civil rights movement in America. And then you go back around full circle again, and you had the four girls that started the boycott movement in Dublin outside Dunnes Stores. They sat there for years and years, and for the first couple of years, they got abused hugely by even Dunnes Stores staff themselves. So, and things were thrown at them, they were jeered, they were mocked, but they kept going. And they would actually write letters to Nelson Mandela himself and tell him about it. And that started spreading, and that went from boycott of goods to then the boycott of sporting activities. So South Africa weren't able to play rugby against anybody, nobody would play cricket against them. This was massively damaging to South Africa. And then it went on to the cultural boycott, where you had bands like UB40, We Won't Play Sun City, and Free Nelson Mandela, and all this. And this brought it into the public eye globally. And to prove that it was actually how important the boycott was to South Africa, when a president is elected, his three most important the first three visits as his premiership are the three most important. His first one was to America, second one was to China, and his third one was to Ireland, where he came not to meet the government, but to thank the people that started the boycott. And they were actually invited to his funeral. That's how high regard they were. Now we move on to to Palestine. And the boycott movement has been doing amazing work here. I mean, globally, the Israelis see that it's actually so dangerous that Netanyahu has actually set up, he has taken one full floor of his office block, the Prime Minister's office block, to fight BDS. And they are actually pumping billions into it. They have tried to make it illegal in so many states in America. They've tried to make it illegal in different countries in Europe, and it's fighting back because boycott is virtually impossible to stop. If I walk into a shop, I cannot be forced to buy an Israeli product. I can go, I want this one. It's a nicer package. You cannot turn around and say it's illegal. And this is why boycott has been so successful. And then where the divestment comes in, so you BDS, so the divestment comes in then, where shopkeepers are not going to keep stock on their shelves that isn't selling. So they will just stop, they will start getting other products in, and people will start moving away because they see that if they're losing money, then all of a sudden it's not beneficial to them, and they will divest from Israeli products. And it's then after that, it's sanctions, that's governments. They can bring in sanctions. Now, I lived in Gaza, myself and Jenny lived in Gaza for 4 years, and the Palestinians in Gaza would love to do boycott, except they're the only ones that cannot. They are forced to buy Israeli products. Israel is the only place that can provide them with stuff, and they have to buy whatever Israel allow in. It's not that they can pick and choose. So they are really caught, and you've actually seen it where if fruit or food or stuff like that is near sell-by date or is going rotten, it goes into Gaza, and this is humanitarian aid, or this is so many trucks of stuff allowed in, but they're sending them in the rubbish, the stuff that they cannot get rid of somewhere else. And so the people of Gaza and Palestine, all of Palestine, are reliant on us to push the boycott. They have no choice but to, at the moment, to use what they can get. So while we have the privilege of walking into a shop and picking what we want, they don't. So I would strongly suggest that everybody push the boycott. Walk into the shop. If you see an Israeli product, bring it to the manager. Tell him that these are Israeli products. And if he keeps buying Israeli products, you will refuse to shop in it. We've done this here with Super Value in town here, and they are very good. He actually actively looks and asks if it's Israeli. If it's Israeli, he tells them he doesn't want it. And so if you can get shops and more shops to do that, you will find that this is going to be very successful. We do need to start pushing the cultural one, because you've seen now with the sporting, the amount of soccer players that have already started waving the Palestinian flag. That's highlighting the plight of the Palestinians to a group of people that have no idea what Palestine is about. All they know about is football. All of a sudden, they're starting to realize, okay, this is something that I need to start looking up. And if we can get that into Lady Gaga or whoever is big at the moment, I'm not big on singers at the moment, but if you can get that into groups like that, and then to start producing songs about Palestine and about apartheid, like happened in the 80s, I think we would have a massive chance of getting to a much bigger audience. The bigger the audience, the more pressure then the politicians are put under, because the politicians rely on votes. And then all of a sudden you find that sanctions then come into place. Because if it's a handful of people, if you only have a handful of people getting onto the politicians, and it's the same handful of people continuously talking about sanctions and boycotts and the occupied territories bill, nobody takes any notice. They'll kind of go, oh yeah, we're looking into it. All of a sudden, if all the constituents are starting to ask, you find then that it goes up the priority list very, very quickly.
Absolutely.
So that's my talk on. Did I stay under the 5 minutes?
No, you did not, but you were very informative. And it was great the way you were able to link the history and the current role that boycott and divestment and sanctions have to play. We might talk about that a little bit further when we're all finished, if we've any time left at all.
For people who might be watching online who are only just kind of becoming aware of Palestine, I just want to give a brief overview of the context that everything is going on in. So basically in 1947, when Palestine was partitioned, is there another slide with a similar image, Brian? Just to show the white on that image in 1947 was the initial settlements owned by Jewish settlers. So it counted for a small percentage of the land. The population was well over 60 to 70% Arab, possibly even higher, depending on which census you go with, but it was a large majority. In 1947, the UN partition plan gave, I think, 56% of the land to Israel. The context there being that most of the world was still a colony and couldn't vote, and that the bloc of first world countries outvoted the bloc of third world countries in a way for them to solve their own Jewish problem, as they call it, because they weren't willing to accommodate the Jewish people themselves. So obviously this was unacceptable to the Palestinian people. and to the Arab people in general, who've seen it as the beginning of more Western encroachment on their land, and a war broke out. At the end of that war, what ended up is the image you see in the third slide there, where I think it's 78% of the land went to Israel, and only 22% of the land in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza was left for Palestine. Now, the West Bank was governed by Jordan until the 1967 war, and Gaza was governed as a Palestinian state under Egyptian protection. But in this context, you can already see that 78% of the land had been taken. And what the Palestinians the Palestinians who were living on that land, which made up Israel proper, obviously would have created a large majority. So over 700,000 of them were expelled. Some of them in the West Bank, some of them in Gaza, some of them in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt. And those Palestinians were directly catered for by the UN RWA, which is a special UN body set up just for the Palestinian citizens. So to this day, there's 5 billion Palestinians who are exiled from what is now Israel, nearly the entire population of Ireland, without citizenship, without the rights in Syria and Lebanon. And that's why the conflict in Lebanon happened in the 80s, which some of our speakers referred to, because the PLO was based in Lebanon for quite a while. After the wars from 1967 to 1973, different Arab governments started to come to accommodations with Israel, Egypt to get the Sinai back, and obviously Lebanon was embroiled in the war with Syria and itself and the Palestinians. And basically more and more Palestinians became interested in self-determination in national liberation movements, and the first national liberation movement, Fatah, was set up along with groups like the PFLP, the PLF, the PPSF, and other groups that carried out an insurgency campaign against Israel and Israeli forces. Those groups coalesced around the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was recognized as the legitimate spokesperson for all the Palestinian people in exile in Israel and in Palestine. In the first Intifada in the 80s, they declared the State of Palestine, which is recognized in the borders that you see in the third slide. That State of Palestine gave up its claim to the rest of Israel, but kept the claim that the exiles should have the right to return to Israel. So in Palestine itself, after the first Intifada, there was, under the Oslo Accords, Israel set up a self-government, the Palestinian Authority, in the West Bank and in Gaza. And if you go on to that next slide, Brian, I'll show you sorry, the one after that, or before. I'm not sure what order you have them in, but the one just showing the West Bank, if you can. Yeah, so if you look here, basically it was meant to be a gradual transition of authority from all of the West Bank and Gaza to Palestinian control. But that protocol was never adhered to, of the Oslo Accords. They did remove a settlement in Gaza in the 2000s, but that was about the majority of the land they get back. Right now, Area A is what you can see in dark red. That was originally only 2% of the land. It expanded slightly. That's under the Palestinian Authority's control. The light red area in Area B is Palestinian Authority administered. The security, the police, the military is Israeli administered. And then Area C, which you can see is the vast majority of the West Bank, is directly administered by Israel's military. And Area C, it's the vast majority of the agricultural land. It's controlled by Jewish settlers. There's over 600,000 settlers in the West Bank against about 5 million Palestinians who are mostly confined to areas A and B. After the second Intifada in the early 2000s, Israel set up walls between the settlements, between Palestinian refugees and the Palestinians who are native to the West Bank and the Palestinians who are exiled from what is now Israel. And every single different facet of the occupation has different meanings for different Palestinians depending on which category you fall into, depending on if they live in a settlement or if they live in their own area. And if you can see that little yellow portion there, that portion is actually completely by Israel. It's not recognized as such by the international community or international law, but they claim it now as part of Israel, and that includes East Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah. One of the saddest things about the Sheikh Jarrah evictions is that those people were originally put in that area as a refugee camp because they were evicted from Israel proper. So not only were they evicted from their indigenous land, but they were then evicted from the place they went to for security. In Gaza, the vast majority of the population, the reason there's so many millions of people there in such a small area is because most of them came from what is now Israel proper. So Israel created the situation in these states and hasn't been helped by the fact that there is a conflict between Fatah and Hamas after the 2006 elections. There's divisions within Fatah and between Fatah and the rest of the PLO and between Hamas and other groups. And there's Israeli Arab, Israeli Palestinian parties representing the Palestinians in Israel, and there's other groups representing exiles abroad. So I suppose for us as a party and as a BDS movement, we need to ensure that we're dealing with representatives from every Palestinian group and every Palestinian community, and we're not taking our lead from one group or the other, which is an important issue. And lastly, I'll leave it on this, and if you can go back to the map of South Africa. This was South Africa during apartheid. So the South African government tried to claim that they were not being racist, that they wanted to just separate hood. That's what apartheid meant. It meant separate hood. So what they did is they created what they called homelands for different African ethnic groups, tiny areas of the land where the African population, the black population, would be given citizenship of their respective lands. A small elite would be put in place to govern. And most of them were overcrowded. The vast majority of Africans didn't live there. They had to travel as migrants to the rest of South Africa for work. But this setting up of small Bantustans, they were called, was widely recognized as never having any kind of autonomy, being controlled by the South African, and being used as a means to disenfranchise the vast majority of the South African citizens. I think if you look at that and compare it to the image of the West Bank you just seen, you can see the similarities there, and you can see why apartheid is a correct terminology. And the other aspect of apartheid there as well is that the Israeli settlers who are there illegally are governed by Israeli civil law with the rights and protections of court. The Palestinians are governed by military law and can undergo court martials. There's controls on the water supply, and there's controls on the electricity. Again, like I remember I was in Hebron, and my story would be very similar, but there was a massacre in the Tomb of the Patriarchs in the early 90s, and a massacre of Palestinians worshippers. The Israeli government closed it for security reasons, they said, and then because of some magical archaeological find, they built a settlement around it because they have a law around Jewish historicals. So not only did they get massacred, but because of the massacre, the Palestinians lost half of their mosque. It's now a synagogue and a mosque. And I remember when I was there, I was allowed to go to both sides. The Palestinians weren't. So I have more rights in that area than a Palestinian, which is the exact same situation as you would have seen in South Africa. In Gaza, over 96% of the water isn't fit for human consumption. So they're genuinely poisoning the adults and the children of Gaza. So in terms of just a general overview of the situation on the ground and the complexities of it, I hope those maps and my few minutes might have cleared it up for anyone who hasn't had the experience, previously with Palestine.
To say, but I can't. Of course, there's no time. It's just to keep your solidarity, your actions, not only words. We need actions. The government are really good with words, empty words. We don't. We hear a lot of Simon Coveney's, but what we need is actions. We need solidarity. We need from all of you individuals, your families, your friends, your works, everywhere. You spread the word, raise the awareness, and boycott the investment and sanction Israel. Israel until they comply with the international law and stop abusing my people in Palestine.
We're now starting to see through the veil. We're not anti-Semites, we're anti-Zionists. There's a massive difference. Zionism is a political ideology. Judaism is a religion.
It's just don't be afraid to criticize Israel. Criticize their war crimes, criticize Israel. That's, you have the right to do that. This is not anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You're criticizing Israeli governmental policy.
Exactly.
You're not criticizing a religion. You're criticizing Israeli governmental policy.
I'd like to thank you all for your speeches. Len, of course, mentioned, I just wrote a few notes here, the social media. The social media played a huge part in this last round. Sheikh Jarrah, the two young lads from Sheikh Jarrah, Muna and Muhammad al-Kurds, their brother and sister, who's one of these families who have been forcibly asked to remove, expelled from their homes. They use the social media, the Instagram and the TikTok, that spread the word. The whole world knows about Sheikh Jarrah and the Palestinian plight now because of this social media, and that's what brought us more attention to what happened lately in Jerusalem and in Gaza. Lots of artists, football player, everybody showing their solidarity with the Palestinian people because of they saw in social media on the live links how the Palestinians are treated by the Israeli forces. The Beit Lahem, of course, Lynn mentioned, and Hebron. I am from Hebron, and I still have families there. The Beit Lahem, there are the living, like in Aida camp, there are our friends who came a few times to Ireland from Laji Center. They are the most tear gas place in the world in the Aida camp in Beit Lahem. James and the UN, thanks again for your speech. And the UN, how they don't, even the island now has a seat in the UN and they can't do anything for us because of the veto that America's, the US vetoed that, and they have nothing to do with us, although the island should speak and be a voice for the voiceless people, as Simon Coveney mentioned once. Derek, great. Actually, I was so happy to hear about the history. Donald told me before, a couple of years ago, about the history. I didn't know what's the word boycott. It was created here in Ireland. That shows how, because the Palestinians and Irish, they do link a lot. They do understand the same because they have lived the same colonial regime with the land, and the whole colonial regime is the same thing. So the boycott worked for them, worked for South Africa. It should work for the Palestinian people. So because the boycott, divestment, and sanction is the most effective, peaceful way for the internationals to support the Palestinian people, as Derek mentioned. So we call on everybody, each one of you, and for the international community to do boycott the products, and then divestments. It's not only divestment from these shops to divest, Derek, but the divestment could be bigger, than like the insurance companies, our pension funds, our like sorry?
Veolia.
Exactly, Veolia, CRH, the cement company, which we had a campaign with as an IPSC. We had a campaign. It took us long for them to divest, but it took us about 8 years campaigning for this, for them to divest, and we were successful. Of course, fighting the BDS, Israel fighting the BDS. I am one of the people who are suffering from this target, because Ireland Palestine Solidarity Campaign was a few years back. They listed us as a blacklist, on the blacklist of another 20 organizations around the world for our work. So that means we are doing something right, and it's a badge of honor, although it hurts me that I'm not officially allowed to go back and visit my people in Palestine, but still that means our work is felt in Israel. That's why they're fighting us. So that's a boycott, divestment, and sanction. Of course, as Derek mentioned, it's for the government, and it's as this motion passed last night, we should push for the government to act on this thing and make this an action, which is to sanction Israel for their war crimes, for their apartheid. The Human Rights Watch, I put it there in the what do you call it? You have it there in the
chat.
In the chat, yes, that's the word, sorry. I have it there, so for everybody who wants to read it, and it's really good for to educate yourselves and educate others about it, to know exactly what's happening. So there are a few things to do as well, actions for like the boycott, divestment, and sanction. There's a new initiative, which is the apartheid-free zone, we call it, which is to make your area or community as apartheid-free zone. You can have your home apartheid-free zone, you can have your school apartheid-free zone, your community, your workplace, anywhere that you don't you don't buy the Israeli products, you don't get, like, for example, the HP computers or any other Israeli products. So that, and you'll declare yourself as apartheid free zone in supporting the Palestinians for their freedom, justice, and equality. We have a campaign which is really important. I want to tell you about. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's the collaboration between the Irish police and the apartheid state of Israel. The Israeli police is responsible, of course, for the brutality attacking the Palestinians, worshippers everywhere. So there's the collaboration between Gardaí and PSNI are engaged in a joint research project with the Ministry for Public Security, that same very same ministry which directly kills Palestinians daily. So we need to end this collaboration between the Gardaí, the PSNI, and the Israeli ministry. So we have all these details in our website, www.ipsc.ie. Of course, AXA Insurance as well. There is a campaign because AXA is collaborating, or it's a multinational insurance company, of course, but has investments in 5 Israeli banks that provide funding for services for the illegal settlements in the West Bank. That's all, I think, from the actions. There are more actions to do, but it's the most important thing, of course, that you start this campaign and raise the awareness as well. Going and visit Palestine, of course, not with this pandemic, everything stopped, but like Lynn, James, whoever, all of you, Derek, went to Palestine and saw with their own eyes what's happening there, and come back and tell people what you've witnessed. It's really, really important for people here to hear you, and internationally as well.
Absolutely, those calls to action are really good and valuable. And what we might do is we've sent out the report you were talking about from Human Rights Watch, but we'll also send out links to the IPSC website as well.
Oh, please do. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat now. And you can join the IPSC. You can join any group that works for supports the Palestinian cause. Sorry, I forgot just something regarding the boycott. It's not only economic, as Derek said. It's a culture, and we have a culture pledge in IPSC that has more than 1,100 something Irish artists pledged to boycott Israel. And of course, we had a successful Eurovision boycott. I'm sure I mean successful, I mean for raising awareness and telling people how the apartheid regime works.